They say the quietest player at a chessboard is often the one already seeing 10 moves ahead, and on that evening inside the Grand Meridian Chess Hall, no one expected the match that was about to challenge everything they believed about dominance and skill. Sarah Mitchell stood near the entrance with a calm expression, holding nothing but a small chess notation book, dressed simply in a dark gray coat that made her blend into the background of polished wooden tables, tournament clocks, and the quiet tension of elite competition. Around her, players whispered about rankings, past championships, and legendary matches, yet very few even registered her presence as anything significant. Across the hall, Victor Reinhardt, an internationally recognized chess grandmaster with multiple world titles, adjusted his cufflinks and observed the room with a sense of controlled superiority, his reputation alone enough to silence conversation when he passed by. He had arrived not just to compete, but to reinforce his dominance, a presence that made every other player feel like they were already several steps behind before the first move was even played. Standing beside him was Daniel Cross, a seasoned tournament judge who had witnessed countless matches at the highest level, quietly reviewing the pairings while noting the growing anticipation in the hall. When the pairing was announced, a subtle ripple moved through the audience as Victor Reinhardt was matched against Sarah Mitchell, a name few recognized and even fewer associated with serious competition. Victor allowed a faint, almost dismissive smile, the kind that suggested confidence bordering on certainty, while Sarah simply approached the board without reaction, her expression unchanged as she took her seat. The contrast between them was immediate, one surrounded by reputation and expectation, the other surrounded by silence and assumption. As the clock was set and the pieces arranged, Victor leaned slightly forward and made a quiet remark about keeping the match efficient, a statement that carried more psychological weight than casual conversation. Sarah did not respond, only focusing on the board as if the noise around her no longer existed. The hall gradually settled into silence, spectators leaning forward as the opening moments of the match began, unaware that the rhythm of the game was about to shift in ways no one in the room could yet predict. Victor opened with a standard aggressive formation, his movements precise and confident, each piece placed with the assurance of someone used to controlling the pace of every match he played. Sarah responded without hesitation, her first move calm and deliberate, neither defensive nor reactive in the way most expected, but quietly structured in a way that made Daniel Cross glance up from his notes for a brief second longer than usual. There was nothing flashy in her movements, nothing that immediately drew attention, yet something subtle about her positioning suggested an understanding that extended beyond the obvious layers of the board. Victor maintained his expression of control, but his eyes began to narrow slightly as the second and third moves unfolded in a pattern that did not align with his expectations of a weaker opponent. The audience remained quiet, unaware that the foundation of the match had already begun to shift beneath the surface of what appeared to be a standard opening exchange. And in that quiet tension, as pieces slowly began to define territory across the board, it became clear that this was not going to be a match measured by reputation, but by something far more precise, the ability to see what others could not yet understand. The match inside the Grand Meridian Chess Hall had only just begun, yet the atmosphere already carried a tension that felt heavier than the silence of the audience, as every move on the board seemed to reshape the invisible structure of the game in ways only a few could recognize. Victor Reinhardt leaned slightly forward, his eyes locked on the position with the confidence of someone who had spent years dismantling opponents before they could establish any real structure, yet something subtle in Sarah Mitchell's opening responses prevented him from settling into his usual rhythm. She remained completely still between moves, her posture calm, her expression unreadable, as if the board itself was simply an extension of a thought process that did not require external validation. Daniel Cross observed quietly from the side, his attention shifting between the board and the players, noting that Sarah's early positioning did not resemble hesitation or defense, but instead reflected a quiet control that was not immediately obvious to those expecting traditional patterns. Victor made his second series of moves with increased precision, each piece advancing as part of a structured pressure strategy designed to force early imbalance, and for a brief moment, the audience seemed reassured by his familiar dominance on the board. Yet Sarah responded without delay, her counter moves not aggressive but deeply structural, reinforcing central control in a way that slowly reduced the effectiveness of Victor's intended pressure lines. There was no visible reaction from her, no shift in expression, only a steady continuation of calm focus that contrasted sharply with the subtle tightening of Victor's gaze as he began to reassess the evolving position. A few spectators leaned closer, sensing that the pace of the game was not following the expected pattern of a Grandmaster asserting control over an unknown opponent. Victor adjusted his posture, resting his hand briefly near his chin as he studied the board longer than before, a small but noticeable deviation from his usual rapid decision cycle. Sarah's next move shifted a key piece into a position that appeared simple at first glance but quietly restricted multiple future paths, creating constraints that were not immediately visible unless the entire board structure was evaluated deeply. Daniel Cross's expression changed slightly as he noted the development, recognizing that the move was not tactical in isolation, but strategic in scope, suggesting long-term planning rather than reactive play. Victor responded with a slight increase in tempo, attempting to re-establish control through faster development and pressure exchanges, yet each attempt seemed to meet a prepared response that neutralized its impact without unnecessary complexity. The audience remained quiet, but the energy in the room had shifted, no longer centered around Victor's reputation but around the unfolding structure of the position itself. Sarah continued to move with the same calm precision, her actions measured and consistent, giving no indication of urgency or surprise, as if every possible variation had already been accounted for before the game began. Victor's expression gradually changed from confidence to focused concentration, his eyes narrowing slightly as he recalculated lines that were no longer producing the expected advantages. The board now reflected a more balanced but increasingly complex structure, where initiative was no longer clearly defined, and the early assumption of dominance had begun to dissolve into a more uncertain equilibrium. And within that quiet transformation, it became clear that the match was no longer about reputation or expectation, but about control at a level that could only be understood through deeper calculation and patience. The tension inside the Grand Meridian chess hall continued to rise as the middle phase of the game unfolded, where every decision carried more weight and every pause seemed longer than the last, while the audience remained completely silent, fully aware that the structure of the match was no longer following the expected pattern of a dominant Grandmaster controlling a weaker opponent. Victor Reinhardt sat with a rigid focus now, his earlier confidence replaced by a more calculated intensity, as he studied the board with increasing depth, searching for familiar advantages that no longer appeared in the positions he had created. Across from him, Sarah Mitchell remained unchanged in demeanor, her posture steady, her gaze fixed on the board with a calm that did not suggest pressure or uncertainty, only continuous evaluation as if she were observing a system she already understood at a deeper level. Daniel Cross leaned slightly forward, his attention fully engaged now, recognizing that the balance of the game had entered a phase where small positional details could determine long-term structural control. Victor made a strategic advance designed to provoke a response and open a pathway towards central dominance, but Sarah responded in a way that did not immediately counter the move directly, instead reinforcing a distant structural point that subtly limited Victor's future mobility across multiple lines. The adjustment was quiet, almost invisible to casual observers, yet it forced Victor to pause longer than before, his hand hovering briefly over the board as he recalculated variations that no longer produced clear advantages. A faint shift moved through the audience, not spoken but felt, as the early expectation of a controlled victory began to dissolve into uncertainty. Victor adjusted his approach, shifting focus to another sector of the board, attempting to create imbalance through positional pressure and tempo gain, but Sarah's response once again neutralized the initiative without urgency, maintaining structural balance while reducing his tactical options. Daniel Cross noted this with increasing attention, recognizing that Sarah was not reacting to threats in a conventional sense, but instead shaping the board into a controlled environment where threats lost effectiveness before fully forming. Victor's expression tightened slightly, his focus now deeper and more analytical, as he began to realize that each attempt to create disruption was being absorbed into a larger framework that he could not easily break. The tempo of the game slowed slightly, not due to hesitation, but due to the increasing complexity of calculation required from both sides, though the difference was that Sarah appeared unaffected by this complexity, maintaining the same calm rhythm throughout. Victor leaned back momentarily, scanning the entire board as a single system rather than isolated sections, an adjustment that signaled a shift from dominance to cautious evaluation. Sarah's next move subtly altered the balance of key squares, not by aggressive capture or direct confrontation, but by restricting movement paths that had previously seemed open, creating a quiet but effective reduction of Victor's strategic flexibility. The audience, though still silent, began to sense a change that was difficult to articulate, as the expected narrative of the match was no longer aligned with what was unfolding in real time. Victor returned his focus to the board with renewed concentration, but for the first time, there was a visible delay in his decision-making process, indicating that he was now fully engaged in deep calculation rather than relying on established patterns. Sarah remained composed, her expression unchanged, her movements consistent, as if she had already anticipated not just the current position but the direction the entire match was slowly taking. And within this growing complexity, the balance of control began to shift in a way that was not dramatic or sudden, but steady and undeniable, suggesting that the true structure of the game was being shaped not by reputation or pressure, but by precision that operated beyond expectation. The match inside the Grand Meridian Chess Hall had now entered a stage where silence felt heavier than sound, as every spectator remained locked in absolute focus on the board, sensing that the earlier assumptions about dominance and control were no longer reliable indicators of what was unfolding between Victor Reinhardt and Sarah Mitchell. Victor sat upright with a tense stillness, his expression now fully concentrated, no longer carrying the faint confidence that had marked his opening posture, but instead reflecting a deep analytical pressure as he attempted to regain clarity in a position that continued to resist simple evaluation. Sarah remained unchanged, her calm presence almost unsettling in contrast to the increasing intensity of the game, as if she existed slightly outside the emotional weight of the competition itself, processing each position with quiet certainty. Daniel Cross stood at a respectful distance, his eyes moving between the players and the board, now fully aware that the structure of the match had transitioned into a phase where small inaccuracies would no longer be recoverable. Victor made a calculated repositioning of a key piece, attempting to reassert central control and re-establish initiative through gradual pressure, yet the response from Sarah was immediate in its structural impact, not through confrontation, but through precise limitation of available movement across multiple interconnected lines. The effect was subtle but profound, forcing Victor to reconsider not only his current strategy but also the viability of the plans he had been building since the opening phase. A quiet tension moved through the audience as they began to recognize that the Grandmaster's familiar rhythm of control was no longer present, replaced instead by longer pauses and deeper calculation. Sarah's next move introduced a level of positional refinement that altered the balance of the entire board, reinforcing key defensive structures while simultaneously restricting the future development of Victor's remaining active pieces. Daniel Cross noted the shift with increased focus, recognizing that Sarah was not reacting to pressure in a traditional sense, but instead guiding the entire structure of the game toward a controlled equilibrium that limited volatility while preserving long-term strategic advantage. Victor leaned forward again, his eyes scanning multiple variations in rapid succession, but each line appeared increasingly constrained, as if the board itself had begun to narrow his available choices without direct confrontation. For the first time, a slight hesitation appeared in his movement, a subtle pause before committing to his next decision, signaling that his earlier confidence had fully transitioned into active uncertainty. The audience remained completely silent, their attention fixed on the unfolding transformation, as the match no longer resembled a contest of reputation, but rather a deep strategic struggle where foresight and preparation outweighed established status. Sarah continued with the same steady rhythm, her movements consistent and deliberate, reinforcing a structure that appeared simple on the surface but revealed deeper complexity with each subsequent exchange. Victor attempted another shift in strategy, seeking imbalance through positional pressure on the flank, but Sarah's response neutralized the attempt in a way that preserved her structure while reducing his coordination between key sectors of the board. Daniel Cross observed that each of Victor's plans was now being absorbed and redirected rather than directly opposed, creating a situation where initiative could no longer be clearly established. The emotional atmosphere in the hall had changed entirely, moving from expectation of dominance to anticipation of revelation, as it became increasingly clear that the match was no longer defined by hierarchy, but by precision and depth of calculation. Victor exhaled slowly, maintaining focus, but the subtle tightening of his posture revealed that he was now fully engaged in defensive adaptation rather than controlled progression. And within that quiet evolution of the board, the balance of the game continued to shift steadily, suggesting that what had once appeared to be a predictable Grandmaster victory was now becoming a test of endurance against a level of unseen structural mastery. The tension inside the Grand Meridian chess hall had now reached a level where every small movement on the board felt amplified, as if the entire room had narrowed its attention into a single evolving structure of calculation and restraint, while Victor Reinhardt sat motionless for a longer interval than before, his fingers resting near the pieces without committing to action, reflecting a rare moment of visible hesitation in a player known for decisive control. Across from him, Sarah Mitchell remained unchanged in demeanor, her calm presence steady and uninterrupted, as if the increasing complexity of the position did not create pressure but instead revealed a pattern she had already accounted for far in advance. Daniel Cross observed closely, now fully aware that the match had shifted beyond conventional phases of opening and mid-game pressure, entering a stage where strategic endurance and long-horizon calculation defined every outcome. Victor finally made a move that attempted to simplify the structure, exchanging a key piece in an effort to reduce positional complexity and regain clarity, yet the exchange did not produce the relief he expected, as Sarah responded in a way that preserved her structural advantage while further limiting his remaining active coordination. The audience remained silent, their attention now fixed not on individual moves but on the gradual transformation of control across the entire board, where initiative appeared less like a single advantage and more like a shifting balance that was steadily moving away from the Grandmaster. Sarah's next move introduced a quiet but decisive structural constraint, reinforcing control over central and diagonal lines in a way that subtly restricted Victor's mobility, forcing him to reconsider long-term pathways that had previously seemed viable. Daniel Cross narrowed his focus, recognizing that the pattern emerging was not one of reactive defense, but of proactive containment, where each of Sarah's decisions contributed to an invisible framework that gradually reduced the effectiveness of aggressive play. Victor leaned slightly forward again, his expression now fully concentrated, as he recalculated variations with increasing depth, but each line appeared to encounter earlier constraints that limited expansion and reduced tactical flexibility. A subtle shift in his posture suggested that he was no longer playing for immediate advantage, but attempting to survive positional compression while searching for a breakthrough that might not exist within the current structure. Sarah continued with the same steady rhythm, her movements precise and unbroken, maintaining control without visible effort, as though the board itself was being guided toward a predetermined equilibrium that only she could fully perceive. The contrast between the two players became more pronounced with each exchange, as Victor's calculation deepened under increasing restriction, while Sarah's responses maintained structural clarity without deviation or urgency. Daniel Cross noted internally that the position had reached a critical threshold where even minor inaccuracies would compound rapidly, turning small structural imbalances into irreversible disadvantages. The audience, though still silent, had shifted from observation to anticipation, sensing that the match was approaching a point where hidden preparation would fully reveal itself. Victor made another attempt to generate activity along the side of the board, but Sarah's response neutralized the initiative with precise positional alignment, preserving her control while further limiting counterplay options. The effect was subtle yet undeniable, creating a scenario where Victor was forced to operate within an increasingly narrow set of possibilities, each requiring deeper calculation and greater caution. And within this quiet tightening of the position, it became clear that the game was no longer a contest of reputation or experience, but a demonstration of sustained structural mastery that continued to reshape the board with every move. The atmosphere inside the Grand Meridian chess hall had now reached its most concentrated state, where even the smallest adjustment on the board seemed to echo through the room with amplified significance, as Victor Reinhardt sat in prolonged silence, his focus fully absorbed in a position that no longer responded to his instinctive sense of control. His earlier confidence had completely dissolved, replaced by a careful and demanding calculation that required far more time than any of his previous matches, signaling that the structure of the game had moved beyond familiar dominance patterns. Across from him, Sarah Mitchell remained composed without any visible change in expression, her posture steady and unshaken, as though the increasing complexity of the position was simply an expected progression rather than a challenge requiring emotional response. Daniel Cross stood with heightened attention, now fully aware that the match had entered a decisive structural phase where even minor inaccuracies could determine the final outcome, and where long-term positional understanding outweighed short-term tactical gain. Victor finally made a move that attempted to reintroduce dynamic pressure through a coordinated piece advance, seeking to destabilize Sarah's controlled formation and create new lines of engagement, but the response came immediately in a form that did not directly confront the advance, instead reinforcing positional integrity across multiple layers of the board. The effect was subtle but absolute, reducing the effectiveness of Victor's initiative and forcing him into a more constrained evaluation of his remaining options. A quiet shift moved through the audience as observers began to recognize that the Grandmaster's attempts to reassert control were consistently being absorbed into a larger and more stable structure that resisted disruption. Sarah's next move further refined this structure, not by aggression but by precise reinforcement of key strategic points, creating an environment where Victor's mobility became increasingly limited across both central and peripheral zones of the board. Daniel Cross noted this with increasing clarity, recognizing that Sarah was not simply defending or reacting, but actively shaping the direction of the entire game toward a controlled outcome that minimized volatility while maximizing positional dominance. Victor leaned forward again, his expression now fully focused and serious, as he spent significantly longer evaluating variations that previously would have required only seconds, indicating that his decision-making process was now under sustained pressure. Each potential line appeared to lead back into constraint, as if the board itself had been reorganized into a system that reduced the effectiveness of traditional attacking frameworks. Sarah continued her steady rhythm of play, maintaining absolute composure, her movements consistent and deliberate, showing no visible reaction to the growing complexity of the position, as though every development had already been anticipated and accounted for in advance. The audience remained silent, their attention now fully locked onto the evolving imbalance of control, where reputation no longer played any role in determining advantage. Victor attempted another adjustment, shifting focus to a different sector of the board in an effort to regain initiative through indirect pressure, but Sarah's response once again neutralized the attempt while preserving her structural advantage across multiple interconnected lines. Daniel Cross observed that the position had reached a stage where Victor's ability to create meaningful threats was steadily diminishing, not through direct elimination, but through continuous restriction of available pathways. The emotional intensity in the hall had transformed into concentrated anticipation, as spectators began to sense that the outcome was no longer dependent on surprise, but on the gradual and undeniable accumulation of positional superiority. Victor's posture tightened slightly, reflecting the increasing difficulty of maintaining long-term coherence in his strategy, while Sarah remained unchanged, her calm presence reinforcing the impression of absolute control over the evolving structure. And within that deepening imbalance, the match continued to move toward a conclusion shaped not by force or reputation, but by the quiet precision of sustained strategic mastery that left no room for recovery once the structure had fully stabilized. The Grand Meridian Chess Hall had now fallen into a state of complete concentration, where even the faint sound of shifting seats or controlled breathing from the audience seemed distant, as the final phase of the match between Victor Reinhardt and Sarah Mitchell approached a level of precision that demanded absolute calculation from both sides. Victor sat with his full attention locked on the board, his earlier confidence now fully replaced by deep analytical intensity, as he attempted to reconstruct a pathway to counter the structural limitations that had been steadily forming against him throughout the middle game. Across from him, Sarah remained unchanged in posture and expression, her calm presence continuing to contrast sharply with the increasing pressure of the position, as if the complexity of the board was not something she was reacting to, but something she had already shaped from the beginning. Daniel Cross observed without interruption, now fully aware that the match had reached a critical threshold where each move carried irreversible consequences, and where the margin for error had effectively disappeared for both players, though the balance of risk was no longer equal. Victor finally made a calculated attempt to break the structure by initiating a sequence designed to open the position and create tactical opportunities, a decision that required precise timing and absolute confidence in calculation, yet Sarah's response arrived with immediate clarity, neutralizing the intended breakthrough while simultaneously reinforcing her positional control across multiple interconnected lines. The effect was subtle but decisive, causing Victor to pause longer than before, his hand hovering slightly above the board as he reassessed variations that now appeared increasingly constrained under deeper scrutiny. A noticeable shift moved through the audience as spectators began to realize that what had once appeared to be a competitive match was now unfolding as a controlled structural demonstration, where initiative itself seemed to be gradually absorbed into a framework that limited disruption. Sarah's next move refined the position further, not through direct confrontation, but through precise alignment of key pieces that reduced Victor's mobility and restricted his ability to generate coordinated activity across the board. Daniel Cross narrowed his focus, recognizing that the pattern emerging was no longer reactive or defensive in nature, but rather a continuous reinforcement of long-term dominance through positional clarity and calculated restriction. Victor leaned slightly forward again, his expression now fully serious, as he entered a prolonged phase of calculation, evaluating multiple lines that all appeared to converge toward similar limitations, forcing him to confront the possibility that his remaining options were narrowing faster than he could expand them. The tempo of the game slowed, not due to hesitation, but due to the increasing depth required to analyze each position, while Sarah maintained the same steady rhythm, her movements precise and unbroken, offering no indication of pressure or urgency. The contrast between the two players had become more pronounced, with Victor visibly engaged in deep recovery calculation, while Sarah continued to operate within a controlled framework that appeared stable regardless of external attempts to disrupt it. Daniel Cross observed that every attempt by Victor to generate initiative was being absorbed and redirected into positional reinforcement that consistently favored Sarah's long-term structure. The audience remained silent, now fully aware that the match had entered a stage where recognition of superiority would not come through dramatic moments, but through the gradual and unavoidable collapse of available counterplay. Victor adjusted his posture once more, attempting to maintain composure as he explored the remaining branches of possibility, but each line appeared to require greater precision while offering diminishing returns. Sarah's calm presence remained unchanged, reinforcing the impression that the entire structure of the board was being guided toward a controlled conclusion that no longer depended on surprise or volatility, but on sustained positional superiority that continued to strengthen with every exchange. The Grand Meridian Chess Hall had now reached a level of absolute silence where even the smallest shift of a chess piece seemed to resonate through the entire room, as the final phase of the match between Victor Reinhardt and Sarah Mitchell unfolded with a level of precision that left no room for casual interpretation. Victor sat in a fixed posture, his expression fully focused but visibly strained by the depth of calculation required, as he attempted to reconstruct a path forward in a position that no longer offered clear avenues for recovery. Across from him, Sarah remained completely composed, her presence unchanged since the beginning of the match, as if every transformation of the board had already been accounted for within her internal calculation long before it became visible on the surface. Daniel Cross stood with heightened attention, fully aware that the game had now entered a decisive endgame structure where each remaining move carried irreversible consequences, and where even minor inaccuracies could determine the final outcome. Victor finally committed to a move that aimed to create counterplay through forced exchanges, attempting to simplify the position in hopes of reducing Sarah's structural advantage and regaining clarity in the resulting configuration, yet the response was immediate and precise, preserving her positional control while eliminating the effectiveness of his intended simplification. The effect of the exchange left Victor with fewer active options than before, forcing him into a narrower set of calculations that required deeper analysis and offered diminishing practical results. A subtle shift moved through the audience as spectators began to recognize that the Grandmaster's attempts to reverse the structure were no longer producing meaningful change, and instead were being absorbed into a system that consistently reinforced Sarah's long-term advantage. Sarah's next move refined the position further, not through aggressive action but through precise structural alignment that restricted Victor's mobility across both central and peripheral areas of the board, reducing his capacity to generate coordinated activity. Daniel Cross observed this development with increasing clarity, noting that Sarah was not simply defending or responding to threats, but actively guiding the endgame toward a controlled resolution where all remaining possibilities converged toward a single outcome. Victor leaned forward again, his focus now fully absorbed in deep calculation, as he evaluated multiple endgame variations that increasingly revealed the same underlying limitation, forcing him to spend significantly more time on decisions that previously would have been immediate. The tempo of the game had slowed considerably, not due to hesitation, but due to the complexity of the position and the diminishing availability of viable alternatives for counterplay. Sarah maintained her steady rhythm, her expression unchanged, her movements consistent and precise, reinforcing the impression of complete structural control over the evolving position. The audience remained silent, fully aware that the match had moved beyond competition into a demonstration of positional mastery, where initiative had been gradually removed through sustained and deliberate control rather than sudden tactical shifts. Victor adjusted his posture once more, attempting to maintain composure as he searched for the final remaining lines that might offer resistance, but each variation appeared increasingly constrained, converging toward positions that no longer provided practical opportunities for reversal. Daniel Cross noted internally that the endgame had reached a critical stage where material balance was no longer the determining factor, but rather the structural limitations that had been established over the course of the entire match. Sarah's calm presence remained unchanged, reinforcing the sense that the outcome was not being decided in the moment, but had been shaped progressively through every prior exchange. And as Victor continued to calculate under growing pressure, the reality of the position became increasingly clear to everyone present. The match was no longer about survival or recovery, but about the gradual and inevitable realization of control that had already been quietly established long before the final phase had begun. The Grand Meridian Chess Hall remained completely silent as the final moments of the match approached, with every spectator fully aware that the position on the board had reached a point of irreversible clarity, where Victor Reinhardt was no longer playing for advantage but for survival within a structure that had been steadily constrained since the middle game. Victor sat motionless for several seconds, his focus intense and unbroken, as he studied the final configuration with a level of concentration that reflected both urgency and acceptance of diminishing possibilities. Across from him, Sarah Mitchell maintained her steady composure, her expression unchanged from the beginning of the match, as if the entire progression of the game had unfolded exactly as anticipated within her internal calculation. Daniel Cross stood at a fixed distance, fully engaged in observation, recognizing that the position had now transitioned into its final resolution phase, where only precise execution remained possible. Victor finally made his last attempt to create counterplay, shifting his remaining active piece in a move designed to generate tension and open a final line of resistance, but the response from Sarah was immediate and absolute in its structural effect, closing the remaining pathways and preserving her control over the decisive areas of the board without requiring unnecessary complexity. The impact of the response was subtle yet final, leaving Victor with no meaningful continuation that could alter the outcome of the position. A wave of stillness moved through the audience as the realization spread that the Grandmaster's options had fully collapsed under sustained positional pressure, and that the structure of the game had reached its conclusion phase. Sarah then executed her final sequence with calm precision, aligning her pieces in a configuration that removed all remaining uncertainty from the position, not through forceful tactics, but through absolute structural dominance that left no viable responses available. Victor remained still for a moment, his gaze fixed on the board, fully aware that the position no longer offered recovery or continuation in any meaningful sense, as the accumulated constraints from earlier stages had fully resolved into a decisive outcome. Daniel Cross stepped slightly forward and confirmed the result in a calm and professional tone, marking the end of the match, while maintaining the silence of the hall that had already settled into complete recognition of what had occurred. There was no immediate reaction of celebration or disbelief, only a sustained stillness as the audience processed the final realization that the match had not been decided in a single moment, but through a continuous and methodical establishment of control from the earliest stages of the game. Victor slowly leaned back in his chair, maintaining composure, acknowledging the result with quiet acceptance, his expression reflecting deep calculation rather than emotional reaction, as he recognized the precision of the strategy that had gradually removed all avenues of resistance. Sarah remained composed as she stood from the table, offering no outward display of triumph, her focus steady and internal, as though the conclusion of the match was simply the natural endpoint of a structure that had been correctly navigated. Daniel Cross recorded the final notation, his understanding clear that what had taken place was not an upset or surprise, but a demonstration of sustained strategic mastery at the highest level of play. As Sarah stepped away from the board, the hall remained in silence, the weight of the match settling into the awareness of everyone present, leaving behind a clear and lasting understanding that true mastery is not defined by reputation or intimidation, but by the quiet and consistent ability to shape every stage of a contest until the outcome becomes inevitable long before it is formally declared.